The afternoon was ordinary in every way. The kind of day people forget as soon as it passes. Cars moved slowly through the parking lot. Doors opened and closed, and the smell of fried food drifted through the air. Inside the restaurant, families sat at plastic tables, children laughed, and workers rushed behind the counter. Near the far corner, a man sat quietly with his young child. He looked tired. Not just physically, but the kind of tired that comes from years of carrying too much. His jacket was old, the color faded from many washes. His boots were worn, the soles scuffed thin. Nothing about him stood out. He blended into the background, like someone the world had learned to look past. His child sat across from him, swinging small legs under the table, sipping from a cup and smiling. The man watched closely, wiping the table with a napkin, making sure nothing spilled. Every move he made was careful, patient, gentle. He had learned how to be quiet. Around them, a group of younger people gathered near another table. They were loud, full of energy, talking over each other. Laughter burst out in sharp waves. Phones were out, screens glowing, cameras pointed at nothing in particular. They noticed the man and the child, almost by accident at first. One of them glanced over and nudged another. Their eyes lingered a little too long. The whispers began, followed by snickers. It wasn't anything the man could hear clearly, but he felt it. That feeling of being watched, judged, measured, and dismissed in seconds. He kept his eyes on his child. The group grew bolder. One of them leaned back in their chair, staring openly now. Another laughed louder, saying something about the man's clothes. Someone else joked about how he must be down on his luck. The words weren't meant to be kind. They were meant to be funny to the people saying them. The man shifted slightly in his seat, but said nothing. He had heard worse before, much worse. He knew how to ignore noise. He had trained himself to stay calm, even when every nerve in his body wanted to react. Today was not about him. It was about making sure his child felt safe. The laughter continued. One of the group members picked up a cup of Coca-Cola, swirling the ice around with a straw. They glanced at the others, a crooked smile spreading across their face. It started as a joke, a dare, the kind that grows when no one stops it. "Watch this," someone said. Before the man could turn his head. The cup tipped. Cold soda splashed across his jacket and shirt, dripping down onto the floor. Ice clattered against the tiles. The sharp smell of cola filled the air. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The child gasped. The laughter exploded. People nearby turned their heads. Some stared in shock. Some looked away quickly, pretending they hadn't seen anything. A few phones lifted higher, capturing the moment from a safe distance. The man sat still. Dark liquid soaked into his clothes, sticky and cold. Drops ran from his sleeves. He looked down at his chest, then slowly at the puddle forming near his boots. His hands rested flat on the table. They did not shake. The group laughed harder now, encouraged by the silence. "Relax, it's just a joke," one of them said. Another added something cruel, something about how he looked like he needed a shower anyway. The man finally moved, not toward them, not in anger. He reached for a napkin and gently wiped a drop of soda from his child's arm. His voice was low and steady. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're all right." The child looked confused, eyes wide, searching his face for clues on how to feel. The man met that gaze and gave a small nod. Calm, controlled, safe. Inside, something heavy settled in his chest. He remembered other places, other moments where noise turned to chaos, where liquid splashing wasn't soda, but something far worse. He pushed the memory away. This was different. This was now. The group kept going. One of them mimicked a military salute in a mocking way, guessing, assuming, making a joke out of nothing they understood. Another laughed and said the man should be thankful it wasn't worse. The man slowly stood up. The room went quiet just for a second. People held their breath, waiting for something to happen. A shout, a swing. A scene got none came. He took off his jacket, calmly, folding it once despite the wet stains. He placed it over the back of the chair so his child wouldn't have to touch it. His movements were measured, controlled, as if every action had been practiced 1,000 times. He turned to the group and looked at them. His eyes were steady, not angry, not afraid, just firm. "You're done," he said simply. The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. Something about his tone made a few of them shift uncomfortably. But pride is loud, and embarrassment often turns into cruelty. One of them scoffed and stepped forward slightly, puffing out their chest. "What are you going to do?" they said, smirking. The man said nothing. He turned back to the table, picked up his child, and held them close. The child wrapped small arms around his neck, pressing their face into his shoulder. The man rested his chin lightly on the child's head. Around them, the room felt different now. The laughter had faded. The air was thick with discomfort. Some people whispered. Others shook their heads quietly. No one stepped in. The man walked slowly toward the exit, every step leaving faint, sticky marks on the floor. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Outside, the afternoon sun felt too bright. He paused near the door, adjusting his grip on the child. His jacket hung over his arm, heavy with soda and something else harder to wash away. He took a deep breath. This wasn't the first time. He had been treated like he was nothing. And it wouldn't be the last. He knew that. But today, it hurt in a different way. Not because of pride, but because his child had seen it. As he walked across the parking lot, the sounds of the restaurant faded behind him. Engines hummed. A cart rattled nearby. Life moved on as if nothing had happened. But something had. The people inside had no idea who he was. No idea where he had been. No idea what he had done, or what he carried every day without complaint. To them, he was just a tired man in worn clothes. And they had no idea how wrong they were. After leaving the restaurant, the man walked slowly across the parking lot, holding his child close. The sun was bright, but it did not warm him the way he wished. The sticky smell of soda clung to his clothes. His child's small hands gripped his neck tightly, and he felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him. In that moment, everything around him seemed to fade. The noise, the laughter, the judgment. There was only him and the child, and a quiet promise that he would keep them safe no matter what. They reached the car, a worn vehicle with scratches and dents that told stories of long days and long nights. The child climbed into the seat carefully, making sure not to touch the wet jacket. The man followed, setting the jacket across the back seat and brushing his hands on his pants. He did not speak much. Words were often heavy with misunderstanding. Silence was safer. His child seemed to sense it too, settling in with a small sigh, relieved to be away from the strange. Laughing people. As he started the engine, his mind drifted. Memories came unbidden, not the soft kind that make you smile, but sharp, real, and raw. They were scenes of nights under distant skies, cold winds biting his face, and the quiet moments when the world felt entirely his responsibility. He remembered the way his heart raced when he had to make decisions that were bigger than himself, decisions that could save lives or end them. Those memories were locked away now, kept behind a calm exterior, but they had shaped him completely. They had taught him patience, focus, and control. And most of all, they had taught him restraint. He glanced at the child in the rear-view mirror. Hair slightly messy, eyes still wide from the earlier humiliation. The child did not understand what had just happened, could not yet see the full weight of the world the man carried. But the man knew it was his job to protect not just the body, but the spirit. Humiliation could leave scars too, and he would not let that happen if he could help it. As he drove home, he passed quiet streets, small houses, and the occasional playground. He noticed details that others might miss. A dog tied to a fence, children running barefoot, a woman carrying groceries. Life moved in small, ordinary ways, yet it was fragile and it demanded care. He understood fragility better than most, and that understanding had taught him humility. When they arrived at their modest apartment, he carefully helped his child out of the car, holding hands tightly. The building was old, the paint chipped, the floors creaking with each step. But it was theirs, and it was enough. Inside, he removed the wet jacket, hung it on a hook, and grabbed a towel to dry the sticky residue from his child's small arms. The child clung to him for a moment longer, and he felt the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders again. Not just to keep them fed and clothed, but to keep them safe from the judgment and cruelty of the world. Once the child was settled, he sat quietly on the couch, staring at his hands. They were strong, scarred, and capable, but also careful. They had held rifles and pencils, carried heavy packs, and now held a child's small, trusting hands. His mind wandered through the years he had spent serving in the military, the missions that seemed impossible at the time, the moments when he had had to be precise and calm in chaos. Those experiences were both a burden and a gift. They had made him capable of restraint, taught him the value of silence, and shown him the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves. He thought about the people in the restaurant again. They had mocked him, laughed at his appearance, thrown soda at him, and assumed weakness where there was none. He could have reacted in ways they would not forget, but he had not. Not because he feared them, but because he understood the cost of losing control. Real strength, he knew, was quiet. It did not need witnesses or applause. It needed only to do what was right, in the moment that mattered. The child's voice broke his thoughts. "Daddy, why did they do that?" The simplicity of the question, the innocent honesty, tugged at him. He knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from the child's face, and spoke softly. "Some people don't understand kindness," he said. "Some people forget to think before they act. But it's not your fault. You don't have to be like them. You can be better." The child nodded slowly, eyes wide, trying to understand, trying to take in a lesson bigger than their years. After the child went to play with a small set of toys, he moved to the kitchen. He opened a cupboard and pulled out a worn notebook. Pages were filled with careful handwriting, lists, reminders, and thoughts he rarely shared. Some entries were about finances, some about daily chores, and some were memories of a life that had been anything but ordinary. He traced a finger across a note, remembering the first time he had held his weapon, the first time he had been away from home for months, the nights when silence had been the only companion. Those memories were private, sacred. They reminded him of what he had been, what he had endured, and what he had learned in the quiet of his apartment. He allowed himself a small moment of reflection. The world outside was noisy and reckless, filled with people who judged without knowing, who mocked without reason. But here, in this small space, he could breathe. Here, he could teach his child the values he held dear: respect, patience, courage, and the quiet strength that came from facing challenges without losing oneself. Even as he sat there, he knew the world would not always be kind. Tomorrow, there might be new tests, new people who underestimated him. But he was ready. He had lived through the impossible, through the harshest conditions, and he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more careful. His strength was not loud. It was not for show. It was steady, patient, and enduring. Later, he heard the child laughing, a small sound that brought warmth to his chest. He smiled faintly, allowing himself a brief relief. There was a kind of joy here, quiet and unassuming, that made all the hardships bearable. Protecting it, nurturing it, would be his mission for the rest of his life. Nothing, not mockery, not exhaustion, not the weight of the world, could take that away. As evening fell, he prepared a simple dinner. He moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, chopping vegetables, warming leftovers, making sure everything was safe and clean. Every action was deliberate. Every step was mindful. In the midst of ordinary chores, he found a kind of calm. This was not the chaos of his past missions, not the roar of conflict. It was quiet. It was human. And in it, he found peace. When dinner was done, he cleaned up and settled in the living room with his child. They sat close, sharing stories, playing quietly. His mind wandered again, not to battlefields, but to the lessons he wanted to pass on. How to be brave, how to stand strong without hurting others, how to understand the value of patience, and how to always protect those you love. These lessons were not abstract. They were real. They were tested in life and in hardship. They were the legacy he could leave. That night, after the child went to bed, he sat by the window and watched the street outside. Lights flickered in neighboring apartments. People moved about in their routines. Somewhere, someone else was laughing at another person, mocking without understanding. But he did not feel anger. He felt resolve. He had learned that anger was wasted energy. Understanding, control, and quiet strength were far more powerful. They had carried him through far worse situations, and they would carry him through whatever came next. He thought about the restaurant again, about the people who thought him weak. He smiled faintly, not for them, but because he knew the truth. True strength was in restraint. True courage was in protecting, not proving. And in that truth, he found a calm that could not be shaken. The world could mock, laugh, and judge. But inside him, a fire burned steadily, silent and unyielding, guiding him forward. And so, in the quiet of his apartment, holding on to memories, lessons, and love for his child, he prepared himself for whatever life would bring next. He did not know what the future held, but he knew who he was. And that, he understood, was more important than anything anyone could ever say or do. The next morning, the man woke before the sun. The apartment was quiet, the child still asleep in the next room, breathing softly, a small reminder of why he kept moving forward no matter what. He dressed slowly, choosing his clothes carefully, not for style, but for practicality. Everything he wore told a story of endurance, of late nights, long walks, and life carried with quiet dignity. He looked in the mirror and saw the lines on his face, the faint shadows under his eyes, and he felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper. But there was also calm in that reflection, a kind of quiet pride that no one could take away. After preparing a simple breakfast, he helped the child get ready for school. There were no hurried words, no harsh tones. Everything was gentle, methodical. He tied shoelaces, packed a small lunch, and kissed the child's forehead. "Be kind," he said, "and watch out for each other." The child nodded, still half asleep, and smiled faintly. That small exchange, ordinary to some, was a quiet victory for him. He was teaching more than lessons from books. He was teaching life. Once the child was off to school, he stepped outside for a walk. The streets were waking up, neighbors greeting each other, dogs barking in the distance, the smell of fresh bread drifting from a nearby bakery. It was a city alive with ordinary routines, and yet he moved through it with careful attention. Every glance mattered. Every step had meaning. He had learned to see things others missed. The way a stranger's shoulders sloped with worry, the hesitant movements of a person trying not to be noticed. He had learned that life was often harder than it appeared, and that appearances were deceptive. As he walked, He noticed a small group of people at a corner store. They laughed, loud and careless. Something in their tone reminded him of yesterday. The memory of soda splashing, of mocking faces, stirred a tension inside him. Not anger, not yet, but awareness. He understood the importance of paying attention. He understood the value of restraint. And he understood that some moments were tests, quiet measures of patience and character. A security officer from a nearby building passed him and nodded. The officer paused, glancing at him more closely. There was a flicker in the officer's eyes, a subtle recognition, but he did not stop. People rarely noticed him, rarely looked beyond the surface. Yet occasionally, someone would see something they could not name. Something in the way he carried himself, in the steady calm of his eyes. It was subtle, quiet, not meant for show, but it was there. Later, he stopped at a small market to pick up a few essentials. The aisles were narrow, crowded, and noisy. Children ran between displays, carts squeaked, and a cashier called out greetings to regular customers. He moved carefully, scanning the shelves, choosing the items he needed without wasting time or attention. And then he noticed a commotion near the front of the store. A young man, loud and careless, was arguing with the cashier over the price of a soda. He pushed a cart carelessly, knocking into displays. A bottle fell, shattering on the floor. People turned to watch, some laughing, others shaking their heads. The man felt a familiar tightness in his chest. This was a small, ordinary moment, yet it carried a lesson he knew too well. Chaos often started small, in moments of thoughtlessness. He stepped closer, not to confront, but to observe. The young man, still loud, was clearly seeking attention. The people around him laughed, egging him on. In another time, in another place, the man could have stopped him with force. It would have been easy. But he did not. He stood silently, arms relaxed at his sides, eyes steady. Observation, restraint, and presence were his tools now, not aggression. The young man eventually realized someone was watching and turned. Their eyes met briefly. For a moment, the laughter faltered. The man did not speak. He did not move. His calm presence was enough to shift the room. People felt it, even if they could not explain why. The young man muttered under his breath, flustered, and moved away. The situation dissolved quietly, without chaos, without spectacle. The lesson was given, silently, through presence alone. Walking home, the man's mind wandered to memories that had shaped him. Nights in foreign lands, cold wind against his face, the quiet sound of footsteps on gravel. Missions that demanded focus beyond fear, moments that required patience beyond pain. He thought of comrades lost, the burden of responsibility, and the small victories that no one would ever know. Those memories were heavy, yet they were part of who he was. They had taught him endurance, control, and the strength of silence. Back at the apartment, he spent the afternoon completing chores in preparing for the child's return. Laundry was folded neatly, dishes washed, the small apartment arranged so it could feel like home, even if it was modest. Everything he did was careful, deliberate, and full of attention. Ordinary tasks, yet in them he found a rhythm, a quiet order that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the world outside. When the child returned from school, the day shifted again. Homework was completed, questions asked, stories shared. He listened more than he spoke, allowing the child to express thoughts freely, gently guiding understanding where needed. In these moments, he felt the depth of his responsibility, teaching patience, teaching kindness, teaching courage, not through grand lessons, but through example, through presence, through the quiet consistency of his actions. Later, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find a neighbor, an elderly woman who often checked in, offering small conversations and shared smiles. She paused for a moment, looking at him, then spoke in a low voice. "I saw what happened yesterday," she said. "You handled it well. Not many would have." The man nodded politely. He did not seek praise. Praise was unnecessary. The lesson was in the action, not the recognition. Yet the acknowledgement was a small reminder that some people could see beyond appearances, beyond the surface of tired clothes and quiet demeanor. As evening settled, he prepared dinner. The child helped in small ways, stirring a pot, setting the table. There was laughter, quiet and gentle, the kind that warms the air in small apartments. After the meal, they sat together, talking about small things, school, friends, and little discoveries. Yet beneath the ordinary conversation lay a deeper lesson. The child was learning more than facts and figures. They were learning resilience, respect, and the quiet power of calm in a world that often demanded noise. After the child went to bed, he sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker. Cars moved along distant streets, shadows stretched across buildings, and the night carried a stillness that was rare in the crowded city. He allowed himself a small sigh, a release of tension he carried all day. Yet even in that release, he was aware. Awareness was constant. Responsibility was constant. The world would continue to challenge, to test, and to judge. And he would meet it, as he always had, with patience, focus, and quiet strength. He thought about the young people in the restaurant again, the ones who had thrown soda at him. They had no idea what they had provoked. They had no idea who they had faced. But that was not his concern. What mattered was teaching his child, living honorably, and carrying the lessons of his past forward. Strength was not about intimidation or revenge. Strength was about resilience, patience, and the ability to act wisely when others acted foolishly. He prepared for the next day with careful planning, small tasks, routines, and reminders. Each action was deliberate, a quiet preparation for life's unpredictable challenges. In the silence of the apartment, he found clarity. In the ordinary rhythm of daily life, he found purpose. And in the quiet presence of his child, he found the reason for every sacrifice, every memory, every lesson learned through years of hardship. As the night deepened, he allowed himself a brief reflection. The world outside could be cruel, judgmental, and careless. But inside, he had created a space of calm, of learning, of protection. That space mattered more than anything else. It was the anchor in a life that could often feel unsteady, the constant in a world of unpredictability. And so he sat, quiet and steady, watching over the city, watching over his child, carrying the weight of the past without letting it break him. He understood that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he was ready. He had always been ready. Strength was not in the noise, not in the chaos. It was in the calm, in the presence, and in the quiet certainty of who he was. And that certainty, he knew, would carry him through whatever came next. This was not just another day. It was another step in the journey of living with dignity, teaching resilience, and embodying strength that could not be shaken by mockery, fear, or misunderstanding. And it was far from over. I can now write part 4, where the tension escalates and the veteran's true identity starts to become known, building the dramatic reveal while keeping it fully human and engaging. The next day began like any other, yet there was a tension in the air that seemed different, heavier. The man woke early, as always, checking on his child to make sure they were asleep, safe, and warm. There was a quiet rhythm in his morning, but beneath it lay a sense of awareness, a feeling that something was about to shift. He dressed carefully, pulled on his worn jacket, and left the apartment, the child waving from the window as he went down the stairwell. The streets were busy with morning activity. Cars honked, delivery trucks rumbled past, and people hurried toward jobs, schools, and appointments. He moved steadily, keeping an eye on the small details around him, the way people carried themselves, the signs of stress and fatigue on their faces, the little movements that often went unnoticed. There was something almost instinctive in the way he observed the world, a skill honed over years of experiences few could imagine. He was quiet, but he was not an aware dot as he walked toward a nearby store to pick up a few essentials. He noticed a small crowd gathering near a park. People were looking at something, murmuring, pointing. His curiosity was mild, tempered by caution. When he drew closer, he saw the group of young people from the restaurant the day before. They were laughing and joking loudly, leaning on a low fence, clearly proud of themselves. But their energy was different today, sharper, more careless. Something about them made him tighten his grip on the small shopping bag he carried. One of the group noticed him first. Their eyes narrowed slightly, then widened in recognition. A laugh escaped, a nervous sound disguised as humor. "Hey, weren't you the guy from yesterday?" someone said, louder than necessary. The others turned, their laughter faltering as they realized he was the same man they had mocked. For the first time, their attention was fully on him, and the energy of their jokes seemed to shrink in the face of his quiet presence. He stopped a few steps away, the air between them tense but silent. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a sudden move. He simply stood there, calm, composed, letting them realize on their own that he was not a man to be underestimated. There was a subtle weight in the way he held himself, a stillness that spoke louder than words. He let them watch, and that alone began to change the dynamics. One of the younger people tried to joke again, attempting to recreate the mockery of yesterday. They pointed at his jacket, smirked, and made a casual remark about being poor or weak. But before the words fully landed, a security officer from a nearby building stepped forward. His eyes widened slightly as they met the man's, a flicker of recognition passing between them. The officer's posture straightened, his voice calm but firm. "Gentlemen," he said, "I think it's time you left." The group hesitated. They were used to drawing attention without consequence, to believing that their loud voices and reckless actions went unchallenged. But now, something was different. The man before them was not just calm. There was a subtle authority in his presence that demanded notice. He did not need to speak louder. The history in his stance, the way he carried himself, and the quiet confidence in his eyes said everything they needed to hear. A whisper ran through the group. One of them muttered something under their breath, a name they recognized from old news stories, from articles about military service, from tales that seemed almost unbelievable. "Is it really him?" they asked quietly, eyes wide. The others looked at him again, and suddenly the energy of mockery was replaced by fear, uncertainty, and shame. They had no idea they were standing in front of someone legendary, someone who had lived experiences far beyond their understanding, someone whose actions in the past had saved lives in ways they could not imagine. The man's gaze softened only briefly, enough to meet the eyes of the one who had thrown soda. There was no anger, no vengeance, just recognition, as if he were silently asking them to understand what they had done and to reflect on their behavior. The air shifted completely. People nearby stopped to watch, sensing the tension, sensing that something serious was unfolding. The officer stepped closer to the group. "You need to leave now," he repeated, voice steady, leaving no room for argument. The young people stammered, shuffled their feet, and finally began to walk away. One of them looked back, eyes wide, realizing that yesterday's cruelty had met quiet strength, and today it was met with recognition that could not be ignored. They had been careless, and the cost was suddenly clear, not physical, not public, but in the weight of understanding who they had mocked. The man watched them leave, then turned his attention back to the few people who had been observing from a distance. Their faces were curious, respectful, and perhaps slightly awed. He gave a small nod, acknowledging that respect need not be loud, that it could be given quietly, can still be understood. There was no need to boast. His actions spoke for themselves. Later, he returned home, careful as always, aware of every sound, every movement around him. The child was waiting, eyes bright with questions. "Daddy, did they do anything?" "Today?" the child asked, curiosity mixing with lingering concern. He smiled gently, brushing a hand across the child's head. "They left," he said simply. "We just need to focus on what's important. Being kind, being careful, and taking care of each other." The afternoon passed quietly, filled with ordinary tasks, chores, and homework. But beneath the calm was a subtle shift. The world, in a small way, had begun to recognize him, even if only some of it. The awareness of others, the acknowledgement of past deeds had begun to ripple outward, touching people who might have judged without understanding. He did not seek recognition. He had never needed it. But the knowledge that respect could exist quietly, even in unexpected moments, was a small comfort. In the evening, there was another knock at the door. A neighbor had come by with a package, and they paused as their eyes met his. There was a flicker of understanding in that gaze, too, a subtle recognition of someone who carried more weight than ordinary appearances suggested. Words were not exchanged about it, but the moment lingered, a silent acknowledgement of history, of sacrifice, and of quiet power. As night settled, he sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker and move. He thought about the people who had mocked him, who had underestimated him, and who had begun to realize that appearances could be deceptive. He thought about the responsibility he carried, not just for the child, not just for himself, but for the life lessons he embodied, the example he set, and the quiet authority he maintained. He reflected on the contrast between yesterday and today. Yesterday had been humiliation, loud and careless. Today had been recognition, subtle and quiet, but infinitely more powerful. People had begun to see beyond the surface, even if only in fleeting moments. And that, he understood, was more important than any words, any display of force, or any temporary vindication. The lesson had been delivered through presence, through calm, through the quiet authority of a life lived with integrity. Later, he prepared dinner, mindful of every detail, as he always was. The child helped, asking questions, learning not just about cooking, but about patience, focus, and care. Every small action was a chance to teach, every ordinary moment a lesson in life. And in the quiet routine, he found purpose, resilience, and the subtle strength that had carried him through so many challenges before. As the child went to bed, he lingered in the living room, looking around the small apartment. The world outside was still noisy, still careless, still filled with people who judged too quickly. But here, in this space, he had created order, calm, and understanding. Here, he could breathe. Here, he could teach. And here, he could prepare for whatever the world would throw at him next, confident that strength was not about spectacle, but about patience, restraint, and quiet authority. In the darkness, he allowed himself a small moment of reflection. The young people from the restaurant, the crowds who had watched, the neighbors who now understood more than they could say, they had all glimpsed, in some small way, what it meant to face a person shaped by experience, by courage, by quiet power. Recognition was not what he sought, but justice, respect, and the subtle acknowledgement of a life lived with integrity were outcomes he understood deeply. And so he sat, still, quiet, and watchful. He knew the next steps of his life would come, challenges and moments that demanded courage and clarity. But he was ready. He had always been ready. And in the calm of the night, he understood that the most powerful lessons were not shouted, not broadcast, not demanded. They were lived quietly, through every choice, every action, every moment of patience and care. Tonight, the world had begun to see, in whispers and glances, that he was not an ordinary man. And tomorrow, they would understand a little more. But for now, he allowed himself a deep breath, a moment of calm, and the quiet knowledge that true strength, always reveals itself even in silence. The morning was quiet, soft light spilling through the curtains, filling the apartment with a gentle glow. The man moved carefully, preparing breakfast, but today there was an unusual tension beneath the calm. The events of the past few days lingered in his mind. He thought about the laughter, the mocking voices, the soda that had been thrown, and the strange mix of fear and respect that had followed. He had always known life could surprise him, but he felt that today would be different, that something important was about to unfold. After breakfast, he walked the child to school, their steps slow and deliberate. He had begun to notice something subtle in the neighborhood, small whispers and glances from people he passed. Some nodded respectfully, a few looked away quickly, unsure of recognition, but sensing something significant about him. The awareness had grown. People had started to see him not as just a single father in worn clothes, but as someone shaped by a life few could imagine, someone whose calm presence carried lessons of courage, patience, and strength. He did not seek it, but it mattered. Recognition, even quiet, could teach others to respect rather than mock. On his way back, he noticed a group gathered near the small park where the incident with the soda had happened. He slowed, curiosity mingling with caution. People were talking in low voices, pointing subtly in his direction. Some remembered yesterday's scene with the young people who had mocked him. There was a sense of anticipation, as if the story was spreading quietly through the neighborhood. A few people approached him cautiously, offering nods and small smiles. He nodded back, polite and calm. No words were exchanged, but the understanding was there. They had begun to see him for more than appearances, more than assumptions. Later, he went to a small convenience store, a place he visited often. As he stepped inside, the cashier looked up, eyes widening slightly, a faint smile appearing. "Good morning," she said softly. "I heard about what happened yesterday in the park." He nodded politely, taking his time selecting the items he needed. There was no need to boast, no need to explain. The story was beginning to travel. Quietly, people understanding that yesterday had been more than an ordinary act of disrespect. It had met someone who carried strength quietly, carefully, with dignity. As he walked home with his small shopping bag, he reflected on the quiet shift that had begun. Recognition was spreading, not through loud announcements or displays, but through the subtle awareness of those who had witnessed even a fraction of his presence and actions. It was strange, he thought, how quickly perception could change once the story of life experience became known. And yet, he remained the same man, quiet, patient, attentive, and protective of his child. The world might see him differently, but his purpose did not change. Teaching, guiding, protecting, and living with integrity were constants, unshaken by others' judgments or assumptions. Returning to the apartment, he set the bag down and checked on the child. Homework was done, and there were questions about the upcoming school projects. He answered carefully, gently, making sure the child understood not just facts, but also the values behind each lesson: patience, focus, and careful observation. In these ordinary moments, he knew he was preparing the child for life, for the moments when the world would challenge, test, or even mock. He would not always be there to intervene, but the lessons, quietly taught, would endure. In the late afternoon, there was another knock at the door. He opened it to find a local reporter and a few community members. They hesitated, unsure of how to begin. We wanted to know more," one of them said, a hint of nervousness in their voice. "About you, and..." What happened at the park? For a moment, he simply regarded them, calm and silent, weighing words carefully. Then he nodded slightly and stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The child peered curiously from the other room, sensing that something important was happening. He spoke carefully, not to boast, not to dramatize, but to tell the truth. He recounted a few experiences, without details that could endanger others, or violate privacy, about life lessons learned in service, about discipline, patience, and responsibility. He spoke about resilience, about protecting those who could not protect themselves, and about the quiet strength required to face challenges without resorting to anger or force. The people listened intently, realizing that the man they had seen only a few days ago was shaped by experiences far beyond their imagination, that his calm presence carried a weight of history, courage, and wisdom. As the story unfolded, the group began to understand why yesterday's mockery had been met with such composed authority. They realized that the man before them had faced unimaginable circumstances and had emerged with strength tempered by experience and compassion. There was no boast, no aggression, only the quiet authority of someone who had lived with responsibility, danger, and the need to remain composed in every situation. The reporter took careful notes, aware that this was not just a story about humiliation or revenge. It was about integrity, resilience, and the lessons of a life lived with honor. Word began to travel further. Neighbors whispered to one another. People who had seen the park incident now understood its context. Respect grew quietly, without fanfare, as recognition of his history and character spread. The young people who had thrown the soda became increasingly aware of their mistake. They felt, for the first time, the weight of having mocked someone they could not fully understand, someone whose calm presence held lessons and authority far beyond their assumptions. They avoided confrontation, whispered apologies to those who witnessed, and slowly began to understand the importance of thoughtfulness before action. That evening, the man sat by the window, watching the city settle into quiet. He reflected on the changes that had begun in such a short span of time. Recognition, respect, and understanding were spreading quietly, like ripples across water. He did not need it, but he knew it could teach others not just to avoid cruelty, but to recognize strength where it often went unseen. He thought about the child sleeping in the next room, about the lessons of courage and patience he was passing on. The true legacy of a life lived well was not in stories alone, it was in the quiet values instilled, in the integrity shown, and in the calm courage that guided every action. As the night deepened, there was a sense of closure in the air. The park incident, once a moment of humiliation, had transformed into a lesson for all involved. People now understood that assumptions could be dangerous, that mockery could meet invisible strength, and that quiet, steady courage was far more powerful than loud displays of aggression. The man had not needed to act in anger. He had not sought revenge. Instead, he had lived his life with integrity, and in doing so, had taught a lesson that resonated far beyond the small apartment, the streets, and the park. He prepared for the next day, as he always did, with careful attention to details, with routines that provided stability for the child, and with awareness of the world outside. But there was also a quiet satisfaction, a sense that justice, respect, and understanding had been delivered not through confrontation, but through patience, dignity, and quiet authority. He had proven that true strength was not measured by how loudly one could fight, but by how composed, responsible, and kind one could remain in the face of mockery and chaos. Before bed, he checked on the child one last time, tucking them in carefully, brushing a strand of hair from the forehead. "Remember," he said softly, "strength is quiet, courage is steady, and kindness is always stronger than cruelty." The child nodded, eyes heavy with sleep, but bright with understanding. He stayed a moment longer, watching the rise and fall of small breaths, feeling the depth of his responsibility and the quiet satisfaction of having guided not just the child, but also the world around them toward a lesson that mattered far more than momentary amusement. Finally, he sat in the living room, looking at the city lights flickering in the distance. The world outside was still noisy, still impatient, still careless at times. But he knew that the events of the past days had made a small but meaningful difference. The lessons had been delivered. Respect had been earned quietly. And he had done it all without losing himself, without resorting to anger, without diminishing the dignity of those involved. That was the true measure of strength. As he finally rested, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The story of mockery, misunderstanding, and unexpected recognition had come full circle. He had faced the world with integrity, taught the child lessons that would endure, and shown those around him that appearances could deceive, but character could never be hidden. The world had glimpsed, in small ways, the true measure of the man behind worn clothes, quiet steps, and everyday routines. And so, in the quiet of the night, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, knowing that the story was not just about humiliation or revenge, but about patience, courage, and quiet power. He had shown, through his actions and presence, that true strength is never loud, never boastful, and never fleeting. It endures in silence, in care, in protection, and in integrity. And that strength, he knew, would continue to guide him, the child, and even those who had once mocked him, toward a better understanding of respect, resilience, and human dignity. The man closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to rest, confident that the lessons of the past days would linger far beyond the small apartment, the streets, and the park. And in that quiet confidence, he knew that he had faced the world with honor, and that true life stories human stories were always about more than what the eye could see. They were about the heart, the courage, and the steady strength that could never be measured by a single moment, but only by the life it shaped.